Welcome all to What's in Store for the World, the future of global food, water and energy security, the last session of the first day of Jewish National Fund's Virtual National Conference. You're in for a treat this evening with our panel discussion on some of the most pressing issues facing Israel, the region and the world, and what is being done to address them. Hosting our session is KKL-JNF Chief Israel Emissary Talia Tzour Avner, who will introduce our guests. Please enjoy what is sure to be a lively discussion.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to all of the participants of Jewish National Fund's first ever virtual conference. A warm welcome to our esteemed panelists for today's discussion. I'm Talia Tzour, JNF's Chief Israel Emissary. Among other things, I oversee the portfolios of Water and Arava for Jewish National Fund. Today, our panel will discuss a topic that is basic, necessary, and essential to the existence of our world: water, food, energy, and Israel's crucial role in these areas. We have the privilege of speaking with three experts in their fields. Seth Siegel is a New York Times best-selling author who wrote Let There Be Water in 2015, which delivers an urgent message on how the world can save itself from global water shortages using Israeli techniques and technologies. He has partnered with Jewish National Fund to heighten American awareness on the issue of water scarcity. He now has a second book, Troubled Water: What's Wrong with What We Drink? Seth has another book coming out next May called Other People's Words: Wisdom for an Inspired and Productive Life that reflects a lifetime of collecting inspirational quotations. Seth is a seasoned entrepreneur who has co-founded numerous companies. Welcome, Seth.
Great to be with you, Talia.
Our second guest is Dr. Joaquin Ruz, Vice President of Global Environmental Futures at the University of Arizona. He is also the Director of Biosphere 2, an Earth System Science research facility designed for outreach, teaching, and lifelong learning about Earth, its living systems, and its place in the universe. He is also the co-director of JNF's Join Institute for Global Food, Water, and Energy Security, a joint program with JNF, the University of Arizona, and the Arava. Welcome, Joaquin.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Always. Dr. Howard Yana Shapiro is the Chief Agricultural Officer Emeritus, Mars Fellow for Mars Incorporated. He is a Distinguished Fellow for the World Agroforestry Center in Nairobi, Kenya, a Senior Fellow for the Department of Plant Sciences in UC Davis, and an expert on sustainable agriculture. He is also an accomplished author. Howard has been involved with the sustainable agricultural and agroforestry systems, plant breeding, molecular biology, and genetics for over 50 years. He also co-authored Chocolate: History, Culture, and Heritage. This landmark work, featuring new and unpublished information on the fascinating history, rewrites the past of one of our most favorite foods. Welcome, Howard.
Thank you, Talia. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. My friends, the world population today stands at 7.7 billion people and is expected to climb to 9.7 billion people by 2050. With this growth in population, the number of people living in extreme poverty in vulnerable communities will increase and will face extreme challenges in the areas of food security, reliable energy production, economic opportunities, clean air, waste management, and sufficient water for drinking and agriculture. Within our large and complex world, there is one small country located in the Middle East, only 72 years old, but very advanced and a case study for us all. This nation is the common denominator for all of us here today, the land and the people of Israel. In this young country, reality has forced great innovation in water, food, and energy shortages which will be discussed on today's panel. Jewish National Fund has recently established a joint institute with the University of Arizona and the Arava region in southern Israel to introduce innovative technology and build capacity for food, water, and energy security in vulnerable communities. It is my honor to now start the discussion with our panelists. Seth Siegel, let's start with you.
Glad to.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey. You had a long road until you reached the topic of water, and now water has become your middle name. What happened?
Well, don't tell my mother I changed my middle name. So what happened was I did have a wonderful career. I started life as a lawyer. I didn't love that very much, but I had an idea for business, and it was quite a successful business as it turned out. I did that for about 24 years. And then along came a big multinational that bought the company, and I was surprised, actually. I thought I'd never sell. I thought I'd do that till the day I died. I enjoyed it very much. I liked business. But after I did sell, I sold specifically so that I could spend the rest of my life in public service of one kind or another. And I didn't know it would end up with water. I began working with Middle East issues, concerned very much about Israel's safety and security, worrying about, this is more than 20 years ago, worrying about the Iranian effort to destabilize the Middle East. And as it turned out, I began learning about the issues of water scarcity. What I did not know, because it was not very well publicized, was the fact that Israel, despite the fact that it's in the driest region of the world, despite the fact that it has the fastest growing rate of population rise in the world, despite the fact that other than Singapore and South Korea, it's had the most dynamic economy in the world for 70 plus years, which is usually a harbinger of lots of water use. I would have assumed that Israel would be a water basket case. And then add in the fact that climate change has grievously affected Israel with about a third of rainfall less on average. This past winter was a rainy winter, but usually on average over the past 20 years, Israel has about a third less water from rain. So I just assumed that Israel was nothing but problems. And then when I began reading more about it, I assumed that there has to be something wrong with what I was hearing. What I was hearing is that Israel was so water abundant that it was self-sufficient in fruits, vegetables, and other agriculture, which is very water consumptive, that everyone in Israel has access to water, and as if they were living in London or New York, and with no reservations about how to use it. And then I even learned that they shared their water supply with the Palestinians. 60% of the Palestinian civilian use of water in the West Bank comes from Israel, about 15% in Gaza, even during periods of conflict, about 10, a little more than that, % of the Kingdom of Jordan's water comes from Israel. And I saw all these pieces and I said, wow, this is an amazing story. Why doesn't everyone know it? And I went looking for a book to read about this. And lo and behold, there hadn't been one. I guess I just had reached a period of my life where I said, I know how to write an email. How hard could it be to write a book? And ended up interviewing more than 225 people. And I was able to weave together the story that became Let There Be Water. And then, of course, Let There Be Water took on a life of its own. It's now, I think, as you said in the introduction, is a global bestseller. It's out in 18 or 19 languages in 50 some odd countries. And I donate all of the royalties to water-themed charities, which gives me an extra boost of joy. And so I'm able to tell this story, and I have told it now to hundreds of audiences all around the world, the story about what Israel has done. And the most significant part of this, the most satisfying part of this, is that it gives communities and countries the opportunity to transform their thinking about water and water scarcity. Because with the Israel example, and the reason I gave those statistics at the start of my comments, the Israel example tells us that every country is able to defeat water scarcity problems. If Israel, in the driest region of the world, with the fast-growing population, with climate change problems, with a fast-growing economy, if they're able to be water abundant, so is absolutely everybody else. And it's a question of smart governance. It's a question of using market forces. It's a question of using technologies, most of which, by the way, were invented in Israel. And it's a question of educating your public. And so I have become something of a combination, if I may change from an Israeli metaphor to an American one, I've become something of a duopoly of Paul Revere and Johnny Appleseed. Paul Revere alerting the world as much as I can to the fact that we have a hazard before us. Water scarcity is coming. But also Johnny Appleseed saying there are solutions at hand. So I actually have a very optimistic message, not a pessimist. Most environmental books are sort of pessimistic. You want to kill yourself after you read them. but the reality is that when you look at Israel, everybody can do what Israel did. And there therefore is a very optimistic outlook over what the future could look like for the world. And I think sooner or later, the world, everyone, even countries that are slow to get to it, will have a smart and good water outcome because they will, one way or another, be following the Israel example. I have a lot more to say about it, but I have so much reverence and respect for Joaquin and Howard that I'd really like to stop here, and maybe we can circle back later, but I know they have important things to say too.
Of course, we have a lot of questions for you, Seth. Thank you so much. You make us all feel very proud, and especially me as an Israeli. Joaquin Ruz, when I reviewed your bio, I rediscovered the enormous amount of knowledge, talent, and experience you have gained in the fields of geology, ecology, and energy. Who are you, Joaquin Ruz? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'd be happy to say a few things about me. I think the base characteristic of my career is that I never had a plan, and which has driven my wife absolutely crazy, but it is a fact. I grew up in Mexico City at a time when Mexico was a place to be if you were a free thinker. Mexico in the 60s and in the 50s was where all the intelligentsia of the world was congregating, in addition to New York City. And for some reason or another, my family ended up in the middle of all of this. So I was fortunate enough to be at conversations of what are now considered some of the great thinkers and artists of Mexico City of the 50s and the 60s. So I ended up in the chemistry department, and I thought I'd do history of chemistry, which is sort of philosophy in a way. But I had a cousin at the same time getting a PhD looking at some pyramids in Mexico that they were close to Mexico City, and they showed incredible cultural connections to the Mayas, which is in southern Mexico. And she convinced me that I should try to carbon date these things because I was a chemist. I didn't know anything about carbon-14 dating, but I went to the University of Miami to do that. And I fell in love with what's called geochronology, dating of artifacts and the earth. And then I came back to the US where I got a PhD in geochemistry. Right after that, I came back to the University of Arizona. I was offered a job here, and I went through the ranks in the Department of Geology, mostly studying things that people will say, what the hell was he doing that for, which was the early history of the Earth and how it geochemically separated into the crust and mantle and core, something that's incredibly useful. And then I became Dean of the College of Science. And one of the most exciting things that has happened in my whole career, the two most exciting things that have happened in my whole career, one of is the JNF Institute, which I'll talk about later. And the other one was becoming the director of Biosphere 2. And those two operations are driven by the same common denominator, which is dreams, almost reckless dreams. In the case of the Biosphere, it was a bunch of artists and free thinkers that built it, trying to mimic what the Earth is. It's called Biosphere 2 because Biosphere 1 is what we live in. And after 15 years of learning about ecology and water and the relationship of water and ecology and energy, which is what the Biosphere is all about, you guys came knocking at my door saying, well, I think that there's a connection here in southern Israel, in Arava, that could benefit from what you guys are doing at the University of Arizona Biosphere and what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Joaquin. If I would have only known that, the result of our partnership with the JNF Join Institute, we will bring you to be such, an advocate and such a, a good fan of the Arava and our work in Israel. We say in Hebrew, Dayenu, it's enough. It's, but we'll speak later about, more of the Joint Institute.
Thank you, Talia.
Welcome. Howard Yana Shapiro. I often wonder if a person like you has become an expert in agriculture, agroforestry, sustainability, molecular biology, genetics, and more, knew as a child what he wanted to be when he grew up. Did you? And also, can you please describe your fields of expertise?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. I certainly knew at a very young age that I wanted to work with the natural world, if you will. I grew up with people who were versed in mathematics, so everything was based on systems. I would look at things and understand it from a system perspective. When I grew up, we did mathematics problems every evening after dinner. When we were in the car traveling around the United States, most kids would be reading comic books. We would be doing math problems without paper. So it was all about training your mind to be able to think three-dimensionally. And it worked out very well as I was educated quite early in life about the power of mathematics, the queen of all sciences, and what that would mean to how I looked at the world. And I've collaborated for decades in Israel, whether it was the Volcani Institute or the Faculty of Agriculture, conversations with the Weizmann Institute now on some very large scale projects. It's always been one of the delights in my life to go to Israel. And I have great friends there. I actually advise a couple startups as well. But it's always been about this hardcore conversation about science. Every one of us on this call, Seth, Joaquin, and myself, discovery is something we love. And discovery is sort of the hallmark of the beginning of a scientific process. And then there's translation. What does that mean? It means that it moves from this discovery shelf to a translation where it starts to have application. And then the really hard part starts, which is scale. So it's wonderful to make a discovery, but if you don't translate it to scale and have impact, then it's just something that you thought of and it was a wonderful idea and you wrote a scientific paper and you put it on the shelf again. So I've been working on this area, but my entire life has been sort of dedicated to understanding patterns and pattern recognition in biological systems. So plant breeding made sense to me, molecular biology made sense to me, genomics, genetics have always made sense to me, landscape ecology has made sense to me. I could see the structure, whether it was from a mathematical basis or otherwise, about how this all worked together. And I've continued that all these years, more than 50 years working seriously. But I remember working on a farm when I was 5 years old, when we were off school, specifically to do the harvest at the harvest time, but also to work. And I was always amazed that if you start with a seed, you can actually grow something that takes the value of the sun, a little water, and produces this biomass, which is nutritive to all of us around the world, whether we're in the animal kingdom or the human kingdom. And it's fascinated me to this day. And I've tried to keep going with the kind of fascination of a young child, age 5 or 6, to keep that enthusiasm through to today. So it's been the basis of how I work.
Thank you, Howard. Seth, so what is the Israeli formula that can solve water problems in challenging areas despite the huge differences between them and Israel?
So the key thing is really a desire. Every society, I don't want to be silly for a moment, but you remember the Rolling Stones song, you can't always get what you want. You can't always get what you want, but you try some time, you get what you need. Well, it's the try some time part that makes you successful. And Israel, from even before it was a state, and I tell this history in Let There Be Water, starting in the late 1920s, early 1930s, the Zionist leadership, there was no Israel yet, so you couldn't call them Israelis yet. The Zionist leadership prioritized 3 areas. And the first, of course, was defense. The second, if you think about it for a second, you'll know, of course, was immigration absorption. And the third was water. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't care about hospitals or schools or roads or those other things. They did, but they prioritized these 3. And by virtue of that, they made all kinds of decisions, made preferences in their national budgets. They put the smartest minds into these 3 areas. They urged them, they didn't force them, but they urged them into these 3 areas. And as a result, by the time Israel is in need of this technologies and in need of this system, you have an entire, if I may call it, social ecosystem that has been created that allows the country to thrive in this world. And so what I would say is that every country will prioritize something different or some different things, not just one thing. is sometimes, unfortunately, in some of the countries of the world, the prioritization is the enrichment of a small class of dictators or authoritarians, and in which case the public doesn't move forward, in which case the water scarcity and everything gets worse. But by virtue of the fact that starting in the 1920s, they began thinking about this, they had a great result. If I can share just an anecdote that I tell in my book, is that there was a man who's totally forgotten to history, whose name was Simcha Blas. He deserves to have, universities and town squares named after him in Israel. A remarkable human being. I've likened him to Leonardo da Vinci in terms of his scope of water insights. So he was put by the Zionist leadership in charge of thinking about water, and they picked the right guy because he was an absolute genius. And he developed what basically became, not basically, he's the inventor of drip irrigation. He came up with the idea of reuse of sewage. He was talking about desalination of water and different technologies back in the 1950s and even earlier. So every single technology that Israel utilizes today, the relocation of water, drilling in certain places, taking brackish water from the Arava, which you've mentioned previously, and treating it and making new use of it, he has now created the toolbox for what Israel needs to do. Now, there's a whole tragic piece of the story as well regarding the British and the British mandate, which I won't get into now for interest of time. But if anybody who's watching is interested, just contact me via my website. I love telling the story. It's www.sethmsiegel.com, Siegel. But just contact me. I'll be glad to tell you the story. But what ends up happening is that when the state is founded in 1948, Blas now has this robust bundle of developed ideas and plans. Like Leonardo da Vinci has notebooks, just like the notebooks of da Vinci, I would say. And then Israel begins making use of his remarkable and fantastic ideas, so that's how they develop this world leadership. But I want to say, aside from the genius of Blas, the prioritization of water by the society, the fact that everybody cares about it. When my book came out in Hebrew, I was invited to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I was in Israel. I came over to Jerusalem. I sat down with him. I thought it'd be a 3-minute meeting. It ended up being almost an hour. And he begins talking to me about water technologies at a level of sophistication that you would think he was working for the Israel Water Utility. And that kind of passion and care at the level of elected officials and the media and schools is why Israel is the water superpower that it is. Again, every country can be doing this. They just have to prioritize it.
Thank you, Seth. So that's a good lead to Howard. Howard, is the world really suffering from chronic hunger and malnutrition, or is it solely a matter of supply chains?
Well, it's a complicated question, and I have a few slides I'd like to show which sort of demonstrate where we have come and where we're going. So when you ask the question, there's a series of things you have to really think about in the terms of complex problems. These are all big system issues, food. It's not something that is looked at independent of complex interdependencies. It touches everyone. The person who's sitting next to you, all of us on the conversation today, our children, our spouses, our grandchildren. And it's not just agriculture. It's economic, it's environmental, it's political, it's social, it's cultural. And these problems touch each of us every single day of the week. And as we start to think about these problems, I have to say that food production is the biggest threat to the whole planet. And here are a few reasons why. By the numbers. Think about biodiversity loss. Think about the use of fresh water in agriculture. Think about greenhouse gas emissions. Think about the fact what we have done to the marine stocks of the world. And think about the fact that agriculture uses more chemistry than almost anything else we can think of. And 50% loss of topsoil around the world. When you put these pieces together, the beginning answer to your question actually is that yes, we do have a really big problem with agriculture. And as an example, I want to show you where maize came from. Modern corn is on one side of the picture. And you'll see this is a seed of teosinte, which is the predecessor of corn. Doesn't it look anything like a corn seed? And in fact, the seed is on the outside of the plant, not the inside, the way we think this beautiful shuck covers a corn plant. And inside that highlighted yellow area is the germ, which is the encyclopedia of information, which tells the plant to grow and how to grow. And when we look at a modern seed, a modern corn seed, it's essentially the same thing. Inside this miraculous thing called a seed is this germ, which inculcates all the information of 7,000 years of breeding that now makes modern corn possible. And when I think about what I have known in my lifetime, from the very beginning of walking a maize field, and this is how I looked at a maize field as a child and as a young adult and as a young scientist. We would walk up and down these rows with a notebook, with a pencil, so if it started to rain, you wouldn't lose all of your notes and your understanding. And we would walk row after row after row, garnering information. And this was the way we made decisions. But now, if you'll start the video, it'll show you what I can see easily in my lab. So a corn seed, I can see that. And then all of a sudden, with modern technology 25 years ago, I could see an endosperm. And as technology moves forward, I could see a chromosome and I could see a scaffolding that held it. And this is a histone. And you start to understand the scale. And now I can look at DNA as easily as any one of us can open a book and read a picture. And you say to someone, well, this is fine. You work at a great university, maybe the best university for agriculture and environmental sciences of the world at UC Davis, and your lab in Kenya is highly advanced. But let me just pull something out of my pocket. This is a sequencer. The first sequencer I used was the size of a VW school bus. I opened this up, placed DNA into the wells, close it up, plug it into the USB port of my computer, and I can sequence a plant overnight on my computer and make decisions in the field that I used to just walk up and down the rows taking observational information. So earlier this month, Jennifer Doudna, a friend and collaborator, won the Nobel Prize for her breakthrough work on CRISPR, which will solve many of the agriculture and human disease problems in the next 20 years, which is our lifetimes. She said something very profound. Just because we are not ready for scientific progress does not mean it won't happen. So just as this Oxford nanopore sequencer I can hold in my hand, the technology of CRISPR, which is a democratized technology which is available to everyone in the world to use, I'm optimistic. But we have huge problems with agriculture. When you have 37% of the children in Africa are stunted under age 5 from chronic hunger and malnutrition, the number rises to 48% in the rural sector of India. It's 7% in the United States. Chronic hunger and malnutrition shouldn't even exist. And with this kind of science that Israel has developed, whether it's the Technion or the Weizmann or the Volcani or the Faculty of Agriculture, and the tools that we now have, we should be able to eliminate all chronic hunger and malnutrition in my lifetime.
Howard, this is amazing. Who would have known, where, science has come through. Thank you. And guys, Joaquin and Seth and Howard, I invite you and remind you, you can ask your, each other questions. I have plenty of questions to ask all of you, but feel comfortable, to ask, each other also, whatever you want to ask. So Joaquin, I'm going back to you. You and I have been working recently intensive together, right? On the Joint Institute and with donors. So in one of our recent discussions with the donor, she mentioned feeling like she was talking to a VIP celebrity when she heard that you are the director of the University of Arizona Biosphere 2. Can you please share with us what is the biosphere and why it is so important for the development of energy, water, agriculture, and sustainability?
I'd be happy to. About 30 years ago, there was a group of, as I mentioned in my first sort of presentation, of what I call free thinkers. Most of these folks were actually artists, and they had a little group that they called themselves the Theater of All Possibilities, which is an incredibly interesting term. They did a lot of things before they did the biosphere. They had a ranch in New Mexico where they were growing organic food. This was 30 years ago. They built a concrete ship. These were people that were like 18 and 20. A concrete ship that then they traveled around the world and up the Amazon, trying to understand how the earth worked. And what made them apart from others is that they were truly trying to understand from first principles how the earth operated. And I just want to take a point right now to tell Howard and Seth, you know, a lot of people sort of confuse science and engineering. And some people even say that scientists are bad engineers. But in fact, science is all about trying to understand the earth, how it is. And engineers are creating an earth that doesn't exist and never has. And if you keep that in mind, you go back into what Howard was saying. How do you go from science to something that you transform? But these folks were basic scientists. They really wanted to understand how the earth worked. And they used to go around the world and try to understand how the corals worked and how the deserts worked and how the rainforests worked. And after about 2 or 3 years of meeting in various places, they recognized, or they believed, that the only way that they could truly understand the system, earth system, that makes all these things work together and controls the earth. How does it control our atmosphere? How does our atmosphere control the chemistry of the ocean? How does the chemistry of the ocean control the well-being of corals? All that kind of stuff. They decided that they should actually build a facsimile of the earth. Something that was large enough, scale, going back to Howard, something that was large enough that the measurements that they were making would make sense. So they created this thing, which is about 14 acres under glass, and they sealed it up so that there would be no interaction between the atmosphere and the inside of the biosphere. And they also put a stainless steel tub underneath the whole thing so that there would be no interaction with the soils. And they put a rainforest, they put an ocean, they put a desert, recognizing that a desert really is something that is important because the whole earth is becoming desertified. So even they understood that. So they wanted to understand how these deserts worked. And then they shut it down and they put people in it to live in this world for 2.5 years. And just like any scientific experiment that you know of, typically they fail. If an experiment does not fail, that means you haven't learned a thing, right? Because you knew everything and you've just proven it. It failed for a physical reason and a psychological reason. The physical reason is that these folks, and they were National Academy members and so on that were trying to build this thing, didn't quite understand how soils worked. And the soil actually started sucking up all the oxygen in the place. So after about a year, the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere of the biosphere too was as though these people were living at 15,000 feet elevation. Okay, so that was one thing. Another thing that, and this was a naive error, is that they didn't seal the concrete because they didn't want it to degas into the biosphere. And the concrete just sucked up all the CO2. So then there was not even enough dissociation of CO2 to make oxygen. So oxygen was a real problem. And the other problem was that these folks didn't know how to grow any food. So, so there was about 1/3 of the biosphere was devoted to growing food for these folks. And they had animals in there, which they promptly all killed because the animals were eating all the food that they could be eating. And then they all became vegetarians. But they had a hard time growing enough food. And finally, the psychology of living, it doesn't matter if it's 14 acres, of having 8 people living together for 2.5 years. And in fact, it did not take too long for the group to break up into 2 sects or groups. One was the white hats and the black hats. They hated each other. They barely talked to each other. And that did not contribute to anything good either. The other thing that we were able to show at Biosphere also in the 90s is at that point, there was a big discussion that CO2 was like the uber fertilizer, right? If you have more CO2, everything will grow better. And we were able to show that above 600 parts per million CO2, the rainforest just went nuts. The physiology of the plants just didn't know what to do with it. They didn't take up any more CO2. And in fact, they started emitting greenhouse gases because of the stress that they were under. So these were fundamental scientific discoveries that were made there. And now what we're doing is we're trying to figure out, because as global climate change progresses, it's not only sustainability what we need, but it's also resiliency. And in tribute to Seth, the hammer of global climate change is water. The places that lack water are probably going to lack even more. There's a social justice component in global climate change, which comes about mostly because of water. And without water, we can't have any food. So we have this program, and I'll wait for my next question from Talia, in which I'll describe how we're working in the interface between water, energy, and food. And that is the core of our collaboration with Arava, in addition to the social component that's required for any of these technologies to work. Because I think Howard would be the first one to tell us that there've been enormous amounts of NGOs that have shown up in Africa with boxes full of technology that never leave the boxes. And that's because we haven't paid attention to governance, we haven't paid attention to culture, we haven't paid attention to real needs of these communities. So the social component of how you address all these technological innovations is very important.
Thank you, Joaquin. And Seth, I cannot hold myself then, asking you. So if you were the head of, let's say, the World Water Authority, what would be your key goals?
Well, it depends where you want to take it. In other words, because you can't do everything, but here's what you can do. What you can do, and again, this maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not, using Israeli technology, and I hasten to add, I'm not an Israeli. I'm an American. I'm a fan of Israel. I'm an admirer of Israel, I think, as everyone on this panel is, but I am not Israeli. So, and I don't work for the Israeli Foreign Ministry. I don't work for JNF. I just have come to the same conclusions that I think that you have, Talia. And that is that agriculture, what was that old line, asked a bank robber, why do you rob the banks? Because that's where the money is, he said. And the same thing is true about water. If you want to have a water-rich future, you need to focus on the problems of agriculture. Around the world, on average, agriculture absorbs about 70% of the water of almost every country. And some countries, for example, Ethiopia is 90%, Egypt's about almost 95%. Iran is the least water efficient country in the world. While they're busy destabilizing the neighborhood, they could spend some of those billions of dollars instead of building nuclear weapons. They could spend some of it on actually developing smart agriculture. Iran uses about 95% of their national water for agriculture. It's really quite a phenomenon. Anyway, since agriculture is where the greatest bulk of fresh water is used, not your teenage daughter or granddaughter taking a long shower, as much as that may aggravate you, that is not the crisis in water. The crisis in water is the fact that farmers don't yet know how to grow food. Many farmers don't yet know how to grow food without wasting copious amounts. So if I may get a little wonky for just a second, I won't stay wonky because I'm not a wonky kind of a guy. And I so admire these two fellows. When Howard was talking before about mathematics, Howard, I have trouble multiplying two single-digit numbers by each other and getting the correct answer. So I am really an admirer of you. And Joaquin, having able to date the Earth going back how many years? I mean, I have trouble remembering what I had for breakfast yesterday. So it's amazing. So what we can be doing here and effectively doing is creating a crash program around the world to bring farmers water efficient agriculture. Now that means a couple of different things. First of all, and here's the wonky part. First of all, it turns out that especially with climate change, where the world is getting warmer, ever more land needs to be irrigated. Rainfall in much of the world is just not enough to grow food. So therefore you have to supplement it. And there's three kinds of supplementation. There is what's called flood irrigation. You've seen that with rice paddies. You've seen those furrows where the water fills the furrows and then it ends up be absorbed in the soil and then the soil cracking. Then there's center pivot. When you fly over America or other places, you see those huge circles in the field. That's center pivot. And then there's drip irrigation. Well, it turns out that flood irrigation is about 85% of the global water use. And why is that a problem? Because due to evaporation, you lose about 60% of the water you use. With center pivot, you lose about 40% of the water you use. And now there are a bunch of technologies out of Israel, and I don't want to name specifically a company or endorse them, but if anybody, again, wants to contact me via my website or otherwise, I'd be glad to talk to you about it all day long. Some fantastic investment opportunities, by the way. But what's coming out of Israel now is hyper water efficient agriculture. So you get to not only use recycled water, so you're reusing the same drop of water, first time, second time, third time, 5 times, but you're using that drop of water to grow food in a hyper efficient way, so that you're using a dripper that only drips water on the root of the plant when the plant is thirsty. You lose nothing to evaporation. So right there, since you're losing 50, 60% from normal irrigation, you are now saving at least enough to grow 100% more food. In addition, again, this is largely an Israeli innovation. This is not genetically modified food. This is traditional and genius plant breeding. And again, Howard, I'm sure, knows all about this from his experience with the Volcani people. And what they had done is they figured out ways, they said to themselves, you know, a plant needs lots of water to grow everything, but we only care about the part that we can eat. So it's out of Israel that they figured out that tomato plants can have very short roots. Tomato plants can have no leaves. Wheat does not need a long stalk, and so on and so forth, where they figured out a way to breed by traditional breeding plants that only will use the water or largely use the water for the parts that humans can make use of or animals can make use of for eating purposes, and all the rest of it, which is wasteful of both fertilizer and especially wasteful of water, goes away. Now, I have a lot more to say about this, obviously, but again, I want to pause here and just simply say, if we can fix agriculture, again, which is something that Israel is a global center of innovation around, if we can solve the agricultural formula, then we will be able to preserve our aquifers, we'll be able to make much less use of the water that we have. And as the world grows from 7.7 billion people to almost 10 billion people over the next 35 years, we will actually, again, I'm an optimistic guy, we'll actually be in a pretty good place and we will be just fine.
So Seth and Howard, let me just jump in here for a second, just because it's at the core of the partnership that the University of Arizona has with the JNF and Arava, and it's at the core of what Seth just pointed out right now, and that is the water and agriculture. At the core of this partnership, we have a technology which is called agrivoltaics. And we've been working in agrivoltaics at Biosphere 2 now for a few years. It was actually highlighted in NPR this morning in some article. But simply put, just like you go and you park your car underneath solar panels when you go to many places these days, you can actually grow food under solar panels, which means that you're growing food under the shade. And of course, you don't have to have the big structures that you have in a parking lot. But the concept, which is trivial, which is let's grow food in the shade and produce electricity at the same time, is profound for 3 reasons. One of them is that what you can grow in the shade allows different kinds of food production. It allows different kinds of timing of the food production, number one. Number 2, the evapotranspiration of the plants on the solar panels makes the solar panels more efficient because they cool them. So you can produce more electricity. And the electricity that's produced from these solar panels can be used for reverse osmosis of water, for pumping of water, and so on. And finally, the humidity in the soil is maintained for much longer time if the sun is not beating on it. So the amount of water required is much less. So we have like agrivoltaics 1.1, and we put it in a box. We've sent it to Arava, and we expect to get from them agrivoltaics 3.1, which means all the agricultural stuff that you talked about. Plus, I am very excited to see what they can do with the solar panels, the electricity. They have a lot of technology to clean up water. Remember, we don't have to have we don't have to have seawater. We can have deep well water, which is not good enough to grow anything, but you can clean that up with reverse osmosis, cheaper than if it's water from the ocean. So that's the boundaries between water, energy, and food. And I cannot imagine a better group of folks to work on this technology together with the U of A than Arava. So the JNF has put that together.
Joaquin, I'm wondering, are you familiar with, there was something that was shown to me while I was doing the research for Let There Be Water. It's a company that ended up not getting enough funding, so it ended up dying, but it was such an exciting idea. And that was, there's two kinds of water. Again, our viewers may not know this. There's two kinds of water. There's surface water, lakes, rivers, and so forth. And then there's groundwater. And depending upon where you are in the world, in the United States, about half of the water we use is from each source, surface water, and the other half from groundwater. And certain parts of the country are much more groundwater. You know, Arizona doesn't have a great deal of surface water, I don't believe. And other parts of the country, like the Great Lakes region, they get a lot of their water from surface water. Anyway, this idea was to take a very thin film, but very durable plastic to cover an aquifer. So by virtue of which you stop all the evaporation. But embedded on top of that cover was photovoltaic cells. And it produced huge amounts of electricity so that you could have a water source right next to a farm. The farmer could take the water he needs out of the aquifer, but not lose half of that to each season because of evaporation. And he could have all the energy he needs to run his farming operations as well and grow lots of food with either desalinated water or just use the electricity for other processes. And I think that, you know, as Talia said before, if I was king of water or something like that, or around the World Water Agency, if there was such a thing, I think that we would urge everyone to start being like Israel in this way, which is to try to take 1.0 ideas and turn them to 3.0 ideas with all kinds of these great innovations and see what sticks after 5 or 10 years of experimentation.
Let me jump in here too. The water we're drinking this morning is likely to be partially Cleopatra's bathwater, because water is a closed system. There's no more water. I mean, we have a fixed amount of water in the world, and either we abuse it or we use it well, is the first principle. There are things called atmospheric rivers that are caused by having a tree cover in many parts of the world which have been decimated. If we were to start to rehabilitate landscapes today, and it's not just planting 1 billion trees, because it's an easy promise to say, let's plant 1 billion trees, but it's the kind of trees, and it's where you plant them, and it's success rate. You know, as a child, everyone on this call put money in the tzedakah box. So on Sunday morning, we would be buying trees for Israel. And even Israel has understood that they probably planted too much of a monocrop type tree system. So as we look at, can we recreate atmospheric rivers which carry water that's created by the trees, ultimately become rainfall? So that's the first point. The second point is we need to have water use efficient plants. It's great to have the irrigation systems we've talked about, but using a technology like CRISPR, which is not a GMO, it's a different type of methodology, we can reduce water use by 65% easily in many plants. 65%. So imagine the work that Seth's talking about and Joaquin is talking about. On top of all those water savings, reduce it 65% again. So what does that mean? You have all that vastness to be used either to produce more food or to be used for other applications, whether it's establishing forests or sharing with your neighbors, whatever the metaphor might be. And then I think the last thing is, in my world, we have to rethink nutrition. It's not just this sort of academic pyramid that we've been looking at since the 50s from the US Department of Agriculture and other agencies like that. Food is much more complicated than that. Nutrition is much more complicated than have a few fruits and vegetables. When are we going to breed plants for nutritional values, zinc or folates or vitamins? And starting to put all this together, water use efficiency, irrigation use efficiency, nutrition values, then you can really start to have a full system. So one of the things that Israel does better than almost anyone, they start to put all those pieces together because they have so little of so much. So they have to make a lot to do with little. That needs to be spread around the world. And if you look at other parts of the world, sometimes there's too much rain, and so we have floods, and other times there's droughts, so we don't have enough. The ability to have plants be resilient, which is a term that Joaquin mentioned earlier. The word resilience means the ability to respond quickly to a problem. That's what everything we're talking about is based on, the ability to be water resilient, to be plant resilient, to be energy resilient. The notion of resiliency is not the new buzzword, it's the only buzzword, because we're at a place where we're on Occam's edge, if you will, where if we go one way, we fail dramatically. Maybe we don't fail if we go the other way, but it's not really success. So we need to take these systems biological or systems approach, the first principles, as Joaquin mentioned. Then you can start to build what you would call a future that everyone has access to, not only the global north, but the global south as well.
So Howard, can technology help?
I think we have to look at technology as our friend. Sometimes people are afraid of technology, but in the area of water, energy, plant science, nutrition, food for a planet, we must use technology to our advantage. And I think Joaquin said he was shipping a box of Energy 1.0, and he hopes to get back 3.0. I hope that the people who are listening to this recognize whatever we're saying today in 12 months will be improved upon. It's no longer this kind of incremental improvement, sort of a nice steady line. It's really going like this. In the world I live in, as a molecular biologist, geneticist, plant breeder, the ability to do things today is so much faster and more accurate. And I believe that to be the case of water and energy. So if we're today at this conversation 1.0, if we got together again in a year, we'd be at 3 or 4.0, because that much change will have happened during that time.
You know, Howard, actually, and all of you, I would tell you that if I were writing Let There Be Water today, the historical piece, of course, would be the same. But exactly confirming what you're saying is that the strides forward, whether it's in the reuse of wastewater, whether it's in desalination, and certainly if it's in the world of drip irrigation, it's a completely different story now. The effects are similar, but the story is a different story because the progress made in just 5 years is more than was made in decades before that.
Interesting, interesting. Thank you, Seth, and thank you, Howard. The University of Arizona has an academic staff of 15,000 people, and with over 50,000 students per year. It is a leading institution in the fields of water, sustainability, and agriculture in arid and semi-arid lands. In November, as you mentioned, November 2018, JNF led a delegation of esteemed University of Arizona professors on a visit to the Arava region in southern Israel to explore cooperation between the three entities, JNF, the University of Arizona, and the Arava region. The delegation was astonished at the achievements of the Arava region and the population, and as a result, the Jewish National Fund Joint Institute for Global Food, Water, and Energy Security was established. Can you share a little bit more about, the beginnings of the Joint Institute and the goals for which it was established? Will the Joint Institute address some of the key goals that were addressed and outlined here today?
Sure. Let me just start very briefly by saying that just so people recognize that there is such thing as luck, how I ended up with Biosphere 2 was emissaries of Ed Bass, who built it, knocked on my door and said, do I want it? And then we went into discussion. Well, the same thing happened with this collaboration. Your emissaries came in first and knocked on my door and said, are you guys interested? And so importantly, the JNF had the vision since day one to make this institute happen. And I am just very happy that you came and knocked on my door. So when we visited Arava, a couple of things are straightforward. The arid region, the solar radiance, all of that stuff reminds you of Southern Arizona since day one. But what hit all of us dramatically is that we saw in Arava the original dream that I understand was the beginning of Israel. These folks are out there to make sure that the dream of making the desert green happens. And as importantly, through schools that they've created to educate Africans and others, export their know-how to other countries. So I went with the head of the Department of Agricultural Engineering. We have one of the best programs in greenhouse technology in the country. And she went. We went with an applied anthropologist who has worked with the World Bank and all kinds of NGOs in Africa forever. And then we also went with the vice president for research. When we came back, the kinds of comments were, the vice president for research wants to do a sabbatical in Arava. She wants to spend 2 years and leave the U of A.
Wow.
That's how impressed she was.
Wow.
The applied anthropologist said, I've been trying to do a program like this, and I have not seen anything similar anywhere else in the world. And Mazel Tov would be, I guess, the right term. And I went there and I just looked at a vision of how you can apply these technologies of drip irrigation and cleaning up water and figuring out which plants you should be growing. And in fact, Arava, I think, I can't remember the numbers, grows what, 60% of the vegetables of Israel or something? It's an enormous amount in the driest and in some ways most inhospitable parts of Israel. So we were incredibly excited by not only the know-how that we saw at Arava, but the energy, enthusiasm, and commitment to make this a better world and to make Israel better as well. So I've been working as hard as I can, trying to keep up with Talia to make this, to breathe more and more life into this institute. And the only thing I need to do to breathe more life into the institute is get more funding, because the researchers, both from Arava and from the University of Arizona, are already working furiously. We've hired PhD students at the University of Arizona. Arava has hired postdocs. We're just waiting for this silly COVID to go away so that these people, we can start traveling. We have a program that we've designed to go and visit Kenya and see how we can address governance and culture and teach them how to have food safety and security. Of course, all of that is on hold because it's hard to travel, except for the technology, right? So we can't send a box full of wires and stuff, and Israel can actually make it better. And that's where we are right now. I've been in this game for a long time. I mean, the game of leading institutional things. And, you know, the dream of creating partnerships that make sense is always in the mind of an academician. And most of the time, these partnerships just go down the wayside because they're hard. It's hard because they're so far away. And they don't work because of all kinds of reasons. I've never seen a partnership that just took over like wildfire, like this one. And this is from the root, from grassroots, right? So it's all these faculty members that are interested in being part of it, and it's fantastic. So I thank you, and I thank the cosmos for my luck of having you come and knock on my door. But it is one of the most exciting things I've done in my whole career.
First of all, thank you, guys. And second of all, I have to give here a credit to our CEO, Russell Robinson, who visioned it, really visioned it. He looked at the Arava as, you know, a small piece of land with so much knowledge and so much experience. And he said, you guys have so much to show the world and so much to advance, other countries and other communities in the world. We have to create something bigger to help the Arava and to help the rest of the world. And it was his vision. And look what happened, 2.5 years later, we're on the road, we're on the track. So thank you, Joaquin, and thank you, Russell Robinson.
Talia, I'd like to say a word about this right now, which is that I did not know much about JNF when I started working on Let There Be Water. I only knew mostly about those little blue boxes that you put your coins into. And as a result of what I learned about JNF, the programs like Arava, which is one now that this audience is hearing about, but it's only one of so many, that I just wanted to share. Since I know there are donors, but also non-donors who are watching this, I just wanted to share that after I learned about this, I have become each and every year since a donor to both the water program and other programs at JNF. I have become a real fan and admirer of this organization. And anybody who's just watching this casually because they want to know more about water, energy, or food, I would say don't stop your education there. Learn more about JNF too. It is just a most remarkable organization that, yes, it helps Israel, but as you see from this conversation, what comes out of Israel helps the entire world.
I think you have to create a program called JNF Squared, and this would be Jewish National Fund fans, and Seth is the president of it.
Amazing, amazing. Guys, I would like to conclude with this thought. The challenges facing the world today are many and complex. Each one of you has touched on the challenges and the desired solutions. It will not happen in one day, but the very thought, analysis, and desire to change are the beginnings of the process. As an Israeli who works at the Jewish National Fund, I am proud of our organization, whose goal is to help and develop the land of Israel through connection to the values of sustainability and tikkun olam. The Joint Institute, which we have been working to establish for several years, will assist both in the development and promotion of the Arava and in the development and advancement of communities in Africa, Asia, and even America. Thank you, our dear and esteemed panelists. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. Thank you to the leadership of the Jewish National Fund. If you're interested in more information about JNF and our initiatives, you can reach me at ttzour@jnf.org. Thank you so much.
Please join us tomorrow, Tuesday, October 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific for JNF on the ground and with the people of Israel, and discover how Jewish National Fund impacts Israelis from every walk of life. The special invitation Women for Israel Sapphire Society reception featuring Miss Universe Iraq 2017 Sarah Idan will begin promptly at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. Join us later at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific for The Faces of Israel, Many Peoples, Many Opportunities, and learn about the breadth and scope of the work Jewish National Fund does for people with special needs and disabilities.